There are a lot of different mountain biking tyres. Why though? It's not like we're going from perfect smooth velvet tarmac on one end, all the way through to hard packed snow on the other, with every level of mud, dust and slop in between. In fact, I would argue the amount of variation in tyres not only underserves the mountain biking public, but also makes it harder for bike shops, retailers and brands selling whole bikes. The problem is that you have to think about what wheel diameter you have, then you choose what tread pattern you want, and then you decide what width you want, and then casing, then perhaps rubber compound. Upon finally deciding what you want, then you've got to hope that it's in stock at the time that you want it, in the place you wish to buy it. These many small steps mean the likelihood of getting what you actually want, when you actually want it, only gets slimmer and slimmer. Now, I don't mind going on record and saying that we simply have too many tyres and ultimately too much choice. When we make these videos, we work with a brand and we talk about the general concepts before Catherine or myself goes away and scripts it with our ideas. When I said, tyre brands make far too many tyres, it's too much, but there are weird names, loads of weird branding that no one really understands, and it's stupid, Michelin said, yes. I said, no, I think you're mistaken. All brands make too many tyres, no offence, and a lot of mountain bikers get by with just 2 tread patterns for almost all of their riding. Thank you very much. And they said, yes, we agree. And then I said, no, you don't understand. Tyres are always needlessly convoluted and complicated. And they said, well, actually, our new range is about having a mixed hard and a mixed soft tread pattern for each casing, and that's it. So today I'm going to explore how we should choose our tyres using their range as an example, but a lot of these ideas will hold water irrespective of the brand. But for complete disclosure, this video is made in partnership with Michelin. So what we need with our tyres is, to begin with, a good front tyre. This will be using that 232 tread pattern we've already spoken about in other videos. It essentially gives a good braking paddle, a transfer knob to get from the centre to the edges, and lugs long enough to penetrate soft dirt, but not so long they begin to flex and warp. If the lugs get too long, then as you lean, that knob will roll and your tyre begins to squirm or slide, and then bam, you're not going to have a nice time. Too short and it won't get deep enough into the ground to begin with. This tread pattern is great on front wheels, and lots of brands have this design to some degree, obviously with their own twists. So why do we need anything else? Well, this style can feel quite sluggish. Now, it's great for braking and slowing down the bike, but unless your terrain is really loose or wet, it's hard to justify having it on the front and back. Lots of grip, absolutely, but it can be quite tiring to ride on climbs, potentially. So in each casing then, you're going to want to have 2 tread options. Now, whatever the casing, you're going to want to have a grippy front tyre. Although, interestingly enough, when you go into your lighter trail bikes, you're probably going to want to move away from that ultra grippy, slow rolling front tyre that we discussed just now, and have something that's maybe a bit snappier. But you're also definitely going to want to have an option for the rear that keeps that bike rolling quickly. Now, having a faster rolling tyre on the rear actually pays dividends in 2 ways. Firstly, you get something that really carries your pace on climbs, especially considering that when you're seated on the bike, most of your weight is going through that rear axle when the bike is going uphill. Secondly, when we're cornering and really pushing the bike, the longer the lugs, the more they're going to twist and deform, giving you something that can feel at worst vague and at times like it really falls off a cliff, and you get something that suddenly snaps on you, breaking out, really undermining your confidence. Now, there is of course an argument to say, do we want to have the most grip possible? Well, absolutely, in which case you could put the front tyre on the rear and double up. Now, do we want different compounds for our tyres? Well, there's a school of thought that says you might want a harder compound on the rear, or maybe harder compounds on both to make them last a longer time. But I think more and more brands are waking up to the idea that mountain bikers on their performance machines want grip. No ifs, no buts, just grip. And having a rear tyre that maybe rolls a little bit slower but is a lot more confidence inspiring when you're going through slippy routes or really loading up the bike on an off camber is no bad thing. We want a tyre for softer dirt that is slightly grippier, if not slower, and a tyre for harder terrain that rolls slightly faster and feels more consistent on hardpack or when being really aggressive with the bike. But do we want to be reaching for our verniers for different widths? Honestly, I'm lucky. I get to ride a lot of different bikes, and almost everything always has the closest to a 2.4 inch width as possible. So I'm going to say maybe not so much. I think we're at a place where the 2.4 is ample for me and strikes a really great balance between volume and comfort and grip and weight. Now, I'm not saying that that's the same for everyone, but I think the idea of constant experimentation with width has kind of gone away a little bit. But how do you choose what casing is right for you? Well, different brands will have different naming conventions, but I simply refer to them as trail, enduro, and downhill casings. If you're on an enduro bike and running an enduro casing at a very low pressure without ever hitting the rim, sort of 15 psi kind of territory, I would suggest that you could probably benefit from going to a lighter trail casing, upping the pressure slightly, and get something that will carry speed better going up and down. Similarly, if you're at 35 psi, it could be worth considering your next tyre having a downhill casing and coming down in pressure slightly. If you have a very high pressure, the tyre will rebound quicker, which can then make things a bit dicey when the traction is low. Simply put, if you have very high or very low pressure, you might not be really maximising your tyre's potential. Now, different brands will use different philosophies when it comes to how their sidewalls work and the level of support they offer. For instance, the Michelin tyres we're using in this video do have quite a damped feel, and on these enduro tyres, I run around 22 psi. Compare that to brands with more flexible casings and it might appear quite low. How else and why else do we want to maximise our pressure and casing options though? Is it purely down to rider weight? Well, not at all. This is an enduro bike. In fact, it's my enduro bike, and it is my go-to bike for riding in Squamish. Now, my typical setup in winter is having that mixed soft conditions tyre in a, you guessed it, enduro casing. Now, when we're riding the trails that this bike feels so at home on, you're not actually going that quickly. Yes, they might feel fast and there might be a lot of information to process, but I would wager a trail runner worth their salt could give you a run for your money, quite literally, down terrain like this. However, when you go to a bike park, for instance, and the trail goes from say 10 to 15 kilometers an hour to 25, you might find that you need a thicker casing. And that's simply because there's so much more energy being put through the tyre at those speeds. You might get something that damps the trail better and saves your rim. But is there ever such a thing as having too much support in the sidewall? Absolutely. Oh. Cornering a mountain bike on trails like that is just one of the most rewarding things to me. And how our tyre casing and pressure plays into that is really, really important. Now I want you to imagine if you had a tyre that was so hard and so firm that the tread always stayed parallel to the well of the rim, you would get something that felt very numb and really undermine your confidence as you went through turns, especially when you're changing between the camber of the terrain. However, if you go really, really low pressure, you will inevitably be tagged on Instagram by the pressure police, your family will disown you, and you'll have to run away. So you want something that lets the tread hinge and pivot without folding over and the rim itself touching the ground. So for my money, if you can choose on a combination of pressure and casing that stops you hitting the rim on really, really rough terrain, whilst also giving you something that really inspires confidence as you come through turns, you're on to a winner. And it's not just down to the tread, of course. If you go for a downhill casing, you're going to get something a lot firmer than something like the trail casing tyres on this bike. So, do we only need 2 tread patterns? Well, that might be a bit of an oversimplification. I would say you need 2 tread patterns per style of bike, be it trail, enduro or downhill, but largely I think the industry and the consumer base is underserved by having simply an overwhelming amount of variety. However, there is one glaring elephant in the room that I haven't referenced. Finally, and it's a big one, there is one specialist tyre that is loved by racers, the mud tyre. Now this tyre could be the difference between a wasted weekend and a big win, and the ability to puncture soft terrain above all else means that the mud spike isn't going anywhere. The issue with it is, I suppose, that it is so specialist, I wouldn't leave it on my bike for general riding, and it would ultimately feel like the wrong tyre for most of the time, unless you live in an absolute peat bog, which you might do, and I'm sorry, I'm sure it's lovely, Mr. Cathro. Why is the mud spike not a good all-round tyre? Well, the long knobs roll more and are less consistent on routes, and quite simply, the all-round soft condition tyres have just gotten so good and versatile in recent years, there isn't so much of a need for the spike setup. But that's it. That's my argument why we could be better served with fewer tyres. Please let me know in the comment what your favourite style of tyre is and whether you're reaching for the super damp downhill casings. Thanks, and we'll catch you next time.